All right, welcome to Chapter 10. We're looking at early ideas about evolution. Prior to viewing this, you should have defined all of the vocabulary for Chapter 10, which would be on the notes portion of your iPad. You might want to reference those as you work through Chapter 10 to make sure that you definitely know those definitions, as they are quite critical in understanding what evolution is all about. So moving on today, we're going to be talking about some of the things that we looked at in our intro activity, which is where we were looking at Eryops. Here's a fossil of Eryops, no longer in existence. It went extinct, tens of millions of years ago, 60, 70, 80 million years ago. And our question on the screen here is, how can we use fossils such as Eryops to support the idea of evolution? Well, I guess we should probably start with what evolution actually is. Hopefully you're thinking about evolution being something involving change. So that's exactly what evolution actually is defined as. It's change. Change in some living things over the course of time. Now, knowing that this organism is no longer in existence on our planet, are there living things today that do resemble Eryops here? Well, if you recall our discussion from our intro activity, you should know that we're talked about alligators and crocodiles and things like that. So while this organism is no longer present today, things that resemble this organism still are. And we can use fossils such as this one to say, okay, well maybe this guy just changed slowly over the course of time, and we have now some descendants of Eryops called crocodiles and alligators. So they're used for a comparison of living things of a long time ago to compare to living things of today, such as this crocodile on the screen right here. Now this is a modern day crocodile. You can find this in Florida right now. Certainly there are similarities between this guy and this guy. So that's what scientists use fossils to do. This one looks like this one, so maybe there's some relationship between them, considering that the Eryops is no longer around on our planet. So this is where we get to talk about common ancestry. A lot of people like to think of evolution as men forming from monkeys or something along those lines, which is not proven. And there's really more evidence to suggest that we didn't come from chimpanzees or monkeys, but rather humans and monkeys shared a common ancestor. So at one time, we really kind of were one and the same species, but monkeys weren't monkeys and humans weren't humans. We were something different. And over the course of time, we slowly changed into our modern day forms, which would be either humans or monkeys. So aside from humans and monkeys, can you list any other species that are quite similar? So think about that. Maybe lions and tigers? Those aren't the same species. Are they similar? Yeah. Any others come to mind? If so, list some. Moving on. If these two species were to have had a common ancestor, what may have caused them to evolve or change? So if a lion and a tiger had a common ancestor, why might they have changed into two different things? Something to think about. We'll be talking about that as we move through this particular lesson. So we talked about evolution already. Hopefully you have your definition of evolution as simply being change over time. So make sure you have the definition of evolution as change over time. Okay, so now we get into a little bit of the story time with Charles Darwin, who I'm sure you probably have heard of. Charles Darwin first proposed the theory of natural selection. Natural selection you might know as survival of the fittest, back in the 1800s. So this is roughly 150, 170 years old at this point, this idea. Evolution had been discussed prior to Darwin, but it was really Charles Darwin that got it more widely known than others. So we're going to be looking at some of the people that influenced Charles Darwin and what got his brain going. So some of the people we're going to look at is Carolus Linnaeus, George Louis Leclerc de Buffon, who we're just going to call Buffon at this point, a little bit shorter, Erasmus Darwin, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, interesting fellow, and then two geologists, James Hutton and Charles Lyell. Geologists, they study planetary changes. So Linnaeus, he was the first living person to really put together a solid classification system. In other words, he grouped living things together based on similarities. And he actually came up with the system that gave us humans the names that we have, which would be Homo sapien. We'll look more at his classification system near the end of this semester. But I guess more importantly, why would it be beneficial to evolutionary scientists to organize living things? Well, the main idea would be to compare. We can compare things a little bit better if there's some kind of organization or order within it. Think about your own closet, for example. If it's disorganized, it's kind of tough to sift through your clothing and figure out what matches and what doesn't match. And that's kind of what's going on with these evolutionary scientists. By grouping things together based on similarities, they can put the pieces of the puzzle together a little bit easier. Buffon, 1700s, this was 50, 100 years before Darwin's time. He was the one who proposed that species shared common ancestors instead of arising separately. So what does arising separately means? Well, that means that in the case of monkeys and humans, arising separately would mean that monkeys were always monkeys and nothing but monkeys, and humans were always humans and nothing but humans. That would be arising separately. Well, Buffon said, well, no, maybe things didn't arise separately. Maybe they had common ancestors. And it kind of makes sense if you think about it. Have we discovered, ancient human fossils? Well, not really. We discovered, human remains dating back like 30,000 years. But if humans arose separately, then if we're finding these dinosaur fossils 65, 100 million years old, shouldn't we be finding some human fossils from that same time period? Well, the problem is we're not. So that might indicate that at some point humans didn't exist, but something that we were derived off of did. So this is, as I was just kind of mentioning, it's based off of the past evidence of life on Earth, looking at those fossils, past life. What was the evidence to support this? Well, this goes back to what we were looking at with Eriops and crocodiles and alligators. We can compare. So we can compare. Erasmus Darwin, same era as Buffon, and he also had the same idea as Buffon, that living things had a common ancestor. The next guy is Lamarck. We're going to spend a little bit of time on Lamarck because his work was flat out wrong, frankly, but it definitely led us to investigate evolution a bit more. So he was in the 1800s, and he proposed that all living things evolved towards perfection. So what does that mean? Well, essentially what that's meaning is that everything tries to fit in to its own environment as perfectly as possible. So we're going to look at a few examples of that as we move forward through the next few slides here over Lamarck. As I just mentioned, he proposed that changes in the environment lead to the necessity of life to adapt to it. In other words, what this would mean is if we had a massive flood, all the polar ice caps melted, the water level increases by 30 feet, Phoenix is now underwater. How would humans react to that change in that environment? Well, the obvious thing that we would do is we would adapt to the water environment, just like fish. We would develop gills, we would have webbing between our feet and toes, and it would just happen. If you've ever seen the movie Waterworld, that's kind of going off of this notion right here. Now you can probably imagine that if we did in fact get flooded, we probably wouldn't develop gills and we probably wouldn't develop webbing. What Lamarck proposed is that if a living organism actually changed, then all of its children would acquire those physical traits as well. And he called this the inheritance of acquired traits, which is a key term that I will expect you to be able to explain, inheritance of acquired traits. And we're going to explain that 2 slides from this point right here. So how does inheritance factor into Lamarck's thoughts? So we've got to think about the genes, for example. Keep in mind that if an individual happens to be a heterozygous individual, big A, little a, they can pass on one of 2 genes. Lamarck had to be thinking about traits that were attached to the DNA, because you can't pass on something unless it's in the DNA. So let's look at his theory of inheritance of acquired traits a little bit closer right here. And we see this in this crab. We can see that this crab, it's living, it's perfectly fine, and we can see it's lifting its left claw. It decides it's going to use its left claw to mash on its opponents here. So as a result of really using that claw, the claw gets massive. And according to Lamarck's theory of inheritance of acquired traits, because this guy works hard to develop that really big claw, all of its children are going to get that really big claw as well. Well, this would be something that this crab had to work at to get. This isn't in his DNA. And how we can see that, or maybe think about that today, would be Hulk Hogan here, who is absolutely ripped in this picture. And he wasn't just born with all this muscle. He had to go to the gymnasium and spend hours upon hours in there lifting weights to develop these muscles. Well, according to Lamarck, because Hulk Hogan went to the gym and worked really, really hard, his son, which we see right down here in his mugshot, will automatically get those big muscles without even having to go to the gym at all. And as you can maybe see at this point, that's just flat out silly. Could his son get to be really big and strong too? Absolutely. But what would he have to do? Well, he would have to go to the gym and work just as hard as his father to get those muscles too.